Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's generating lots of heat and hopefully some light on social media and beyond. With me today are the journalist and broadcaster Lola Adeshoye, the author and blogger Richard Phillips, and the executive director of the Policy Centre for African People, Sylvie Abua-Bradwell. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. It's very good to see you as always. Now, it was created in 1945 with a clear mission to promote international cooperation and prevent war. But these days, the United Nations is accused of multiple failures, from the catastrophic conflict in Syria and Yemen to an imperialist dominance of the Security Council. Critics also say the UN is also weakened by the likes of Israel and Sri Lanka, which ignore its resolutions, and the United States, which has threatened member states and withdrawn from several key institutions. Sexual abuse by UN peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic has also reduced confidence. Still, supporters say no other body has a track record or capacity to support vulnerable communities around the world. But even the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres himself, has admitted the UN's flaws are so serious they keep him awake at night. So will his reforms be enough, or is the UN doomed to long-term decline? Okay, panel, I'm going to start off with you guys. So the UN started off in 1945 with 50 members. It now has 193, nearly every country in the world, Lola. When you look at this venerable institution, what do you see?
I think the UN is fundamentally flawed. I think it's important, but it has so many issues systematically that it needs to fix, and pretty soon. That is very concerning.
In what way do you think it needs to be fixed? I mean, what is the number one problem as far as you're concerned? Because, I mean, there are so many different institutions, and in the end, it's a collection of member states.
Yeah, I mean, it's a political body, and I don't think it's supposed to be, but the point is that each member state pretty much seems to act in its own interests. And I think that is really the problem, because the UN is supposed to be there for the world. Yeah. And so if Russia is doing things out in its own interest and America's doing things in its own interest which go against what is actually in the interest of the world, particularly in conflict situations, then that's a problem.
All right, but at least, Richard, we have not yet had another world war on the scale of what we had between 1939 and 1945, and that's what the UN was set up to prevent. So in some ways you could say success.
Yes, I mean, I think before the United Nations, we had the League of Nations, which sort of disappeared, and then after the Second World War, the UN was, founded. It was then perceived, I mean, I take issue with the point you're making about the interest. All nations act in their own interests. They have to have a perceived common interest in order that they can act in a collective interest. If they don't, they're simply not going to do it. And it's naive, I think, to think anything else. I think the UN is misused in lots of ways. I think the argument for having 5 permanent members, US, Russia, China,
Britain and
France seems ludicrously antiquated. On the other hand, as a kind of representation of the real truth of power, it probably is accurate. The idea that, Iceland with 300,000 people is going to have as much influence as China or America is absurd. And there are a lot of anomalies. But one point I just wanted to pick you up with on, Henry, was the very first thing you said, which was to do with people breaking UN resolutions. I just wanted to point out to you that one of the most oft-quoted resolutions is 242, which is about the the post-1967 situation. What isn't said about that is that 18 Arab countries have failed to recognise their side of it, which was to recognise Israel. And that's also part of Resolution 242.
Well, people acting their own self-interest.
Yes.
What do you think the key problem is with the UN, Sylvie? Or do you see it actually as just reflective of who we are as human beings on this planet?
Exactly. The thing is, the seeds of the problems we are seeing now were already there from the beginning, in the sense that the United Nations were supposed to end wars and all that, but it has no standing army. So it is only logical that whoever is going to put the money to sustain the army will use it for its own interest.
And who will decide what that army does?
Exactly. The same thing with ending human rights abuses. But as we know, what is human rights abuse to one country could be seen by another as defense and all sorts of things. However, what I would not like to do is to give the impression that the United Nations are doomed to failure, because it will only be as good as we want it to be. It is up to us to A, reform it, and B, recover the sense of common purpose that led to its creation in the first place. As long as this is not there, there won't be any progress. And probably because of the failures that we are going to be seeing with disruptive individuals such as Donald Trump, we are going to really start valuing it sooner or later.
What say you to that, Lola? I mean, because Richard was implying that you were naive in your opening salvo.
That's okay, Richard. But I'm not naive, because the point is exactly what Sylvie said, that what is, human rights abuse to one person may not be, or one state might not be a human rights abuse to another. So if you take, for example, in Syria, where Russia has basically obstructed UN activity, that's resulted in massive deaths. That is a problem. And so, yes, okay, maybe it's naive to think that people won't act in their own self-interest, but when it's causing humanitarian crisis and loss of life on a mass scale, then that is definitely problematic.
It is problematic, but what on earth can you do about it? Because if, Russia chooses to intervene in Syria and essentially creates a point where they're going to have to be militarily confronted in order for that to stop, or at least, a game of poker is going to have to be played where that threat is going to be implicit or explicit, then it becomes very difficult, because in the end, America is not going to intervene on neutral soil to take on Russia. It's just not going to happen.
All right, let me stop you there, because we need to develop one or two of those points, particularly the Security Council, because out of all these UN bodies, the one that generates the most controversy is the Security Council, partly because of its constitution and its power to authorize military action. Its 5 permanent members, we know them very well, but the US, Russia, China, Britain and France are joined by 10 others who are elected by the General Assembly and serve for 2 years. And together they deliberate on the major security issues of the day and recommend action. But any resolutions they recommend can be vetoed by any of the 5 permanent members. Well, let's talk to Bob Ayres, a security analyst and retired US intelligence officer. He joins us via Skype from the southwest of England. Bob, hello to you.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well indeed. So when you look at the Security Council, what do you see? How do you assess the performance of it?
The only time the Security Council has done something of serious note was when they backed intervention in the Korean War. And that was only because the Russian delegation had walked out of the UN and they were not there to veto the resolution. I've been listening to the panel members, and I think they're all very correct in their assertion that it's very difficult to find a cause that all 190 some odd member states of the United Nations would agree to. But even assuming that all 193 states could agree to something like, just for example, free lunches for children, you then run into the next problem of who's going to pay for it. And member states in the United Nations don't want to pay, even when they want something done, they don't want to pay for it. So I think we have a fundamentally flawed institution. The member states are in it to maximize their own benefit, not the benefit of the common good. There's no enforcement mechanism, and nobody wants to pay for it. But other than that, it sounds like a pretty good organization.
Do you think then the fact that most of the countries don't want to pay for it, and the US pays something like 22% of the overall UN budget, it gives the United States an exaggerated influence, a role that is too strong, too powerful on the Security Council?
No, not at all. The US does not exert national power through the device of the United Nations. They certainly don't project power through the Security Council. The only power that the United States really has in the United Nations is the power of the purse. And every time the United States threatens to stop paying for something, then everybody gets all upset in a tizzy, and then they start to maybe cough up some more money. But the United States does not project power through an international organization like the United Nations.
No, don't all the 5 permanent members project power, not least by their use of the veto, and the United States has been criticized routinely for vetoing resolutions that criticize Israel or its own interests, threatening to withdraw money, as it might do from the Human Rights Council, or pulling out of UNICEF. It does that routinely, doesn't it?
That's an interesting question, because since nobody complies with the resolutions that are passed, and there's no penalty for ignoring them. I don't understand what the significance or power projection is to veto a resolution that nobody's going to follow anyway if they don't like it.
But isn't the biggest problem with the United Nations that the key countries who put the money in, like the United States, their influence is exaggerated. It's a hangover from World War II, and you should have other permanent members like India or an African country. Without that, it's skewed.
I guess it's difficult to create any sort of an institution or any sort of an organization in which you have members that are so widely disparate in terms of their gross national product, in terms of their population, in terms of their industrialization. When you have an organization in which a country like China is treated the same as Pago, then there's an imbalance there. And I don't know how you correct that. Mm-hmm. The United States Constitution tried to give people representatives based on population, and then another set of representatives based on a political entity, in this case a state. So if the United Nations was to follow something along those lines, and let's say you had one member in the United Nations for every million people in your country, well, the United States would have 3 people. The Chinese would have, what's a billion by a million, but 100 of them.
Yep.
Then if you had some other number, another institution in which each nation had 2 representatives or 3 or 4, whatever the number may be, just based on the fact that it's a national entity with sovereignty, then you have 2 institutions that can balance each other out. One that's based on population, the other that's based on a political entity.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Let's see if that's taken up, Bob. One more thing. Donald Trump, a disruptor, he wants to see reforms at the UN. Do you think he's a force for good as far as the UN is concerned? They've got to change. Or do you think he's undermining it, weakening it further?
I know this is a very pessimistic thing to say, but based on the way the United Nations has been able to deal with and address international problems of significance over the last couple of decades, I'm not sure that Trump meddling with the United Nations is going to make any difference or not.
All right. Bob Ayres, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, as you'd expect, there's been lots of social traffic on the social media traffic, and here's what you've been saying. First, on Twitter, we have this from Megan, who says, she quotes Richard Gowan, saying the UN Security Council is, and I quote, trapped between the legacy of old wars its members cannot let go, current wars they cannot stop, and the dangers of a future that most diplomats barely understand. And then we have Maxton, who says, with reform, more accountability, flexibility and accountability, the UN would be able to act on fragile issues without having to bother about endless red tape and bureaucracy. And we have on Facebook, Ismail Blagrove, who says, the corruption that currently besets the United Nations explains why Israel's been able to get away with flouting UN resolution after UN resolution. And finally, we have this from Louisa Paul, who says, the United Nations, like most institutions, has its flaws. However, never underestimate its importance to the world or in the world. For all the bureaucracy and accusations of hypocrisy, it is an overwhelming force for good. Now, remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle DoublingDownTV. Panel, let's get your reaction to one or two of those. Well, Israel's been singled out again by Ishmael there, Richard. Then we have Louisa Sylvie, who says the United Nations has its flaws, but never underestimate its importance in the world. And then Lola, the UN Security Council is trapped between the legacy of old wars its members cannot let go, current wars they cannot stop. Who wants to go with what?
Yes, please. I think your guest was being disingenuous in the sense that actually the United Nations were created by the winners of the Second World War in order to project power, but in a softer way.
Yes.
And to say right now that it's a useless organization and all that is to
I don't think he quite said it was useless.
It's to betray a lack of vision in the sense that what the criticism coming from the Americans above all betrays is the fact that they don't understand that it is actually a tool that they could use, but for the common good. And the reason they are presenting the United Nations now in opposition to America is because a lot of self-interest has taken over the vision of leadership.
Self-interest rules, period, in life. It's a fundamental rule of life.
Exactly.
It's what it's about.
It shouldn't be you can promote self-interest by also promoting good.
Only
but
if
when
you
want to
perceive
selfishly defend someone who is occupying another one's country like Israel, when the majority of the countries in the world say that it shouldn't have existed, it shouldn't, not so much that it shouldn't have existed, but it shouldn't be in the state it is now. We understand that there has to be two-state solutions, but when there hasn't even the opportunity to have a Palestinian state, no matter how hard and how much you shout, there is a basic injustice that the United States...
Let me just say this way. Okay. There is a very, very simple path to a two-state solution, and it is for other countries not... Let me finish. They have not recognised Israel, and if they were to, that would stop it in 5 minutes flat. It would shoot their fox.
And if the others leave the land they are occupying, it will end as soon as possible, because they may say they don't recognize, but they will never dare occupy Israel because they haven't got the means.
Let's move on, because Lola, I did run that one by you about the UN is basically trapped in a time warp. You know, the legacy of old wars, its members cannot let go, and current wars they cannot stop.
Well, it's just the problem of the sort of West now in some ways. Plus, they have obviously Russia and China and all this, but it's this kind of how do you move forward in keeping with the times that we're in today, and it's become a gigantic organisation, extremely bureaucratic. I think it is necessary. I think it is necessary for perception, if anything, actually. But it might be time for there to be creation of a junior UN. If you want to
not another body. There are so many. It's constantly morphing and developing. Yeah, but every time there's a new issue.
What I mean, though, is to actually, with the aim of phasing out the UN as it exists currently.
Right. Okay. We might come to that. In fact, I might put that to our next guest, who's the specialist on these matters. The new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he's also a specialist, as seen here on a recent visit to peacekeeping troops in Mali, has prioritised its, quotes, fragmented structures, Byzantine procedures and endless red tape, saying they keep him awake at night. So how should it be reformed? Let's talk to Paul Rogers, Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. Good to see you, Paul.
Hello, Henry. Nice to be with you.
Excellent. Now, some critics say this reform process is too much about internal matters and not enough about big reforms like those we've been discussing, like changing the membership of the Security Council or removing the veto powers. What do you think that his priorities should be?
I think, given the reality at present that the UN is the prisoner of its own members, its own charter, and of course you actually have the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who can essentially veto change. So I think Guterres actually has the potential to be a really good Secretary General. He's coming at it from one side, and he's looking at other aspects of the organization which can be reformed by people like him, and some of the appointments he's been making really move in that direction over the next 2 to 3 years. He would like, I think, dearly in the longer term to reform the entire structure. But at root, it is basically an indication of the kind of membership of where world power lies. The problem at that level, though, of course, is that the Security Council, or those 5 permanent members, no longer properly reflects the nature of even world power. You don't have major countries like India or Brazil as permanent members. You have 5 permanent members, including Britain and France, who both have their problems of a kind of delusion of post-imperial grandeur. But they would stop in the way of any reform. So I think what he is trying to do is to reform those parts of the UN that are within his means to move reform and hopefully improve the overall standing of the organization in doing that, I think.
But do you think the kind of reforms he's bringing in are going to result in a more dynamic UN and one that can genuinely respond when there are problems on the ground in Central African Republic and nobody wants to get involved, or Mali when you have a former colonial power getting involved, or in places like Yemen and Syria where there are stalemates?
Yeah, I think this is what he's trying to do. I mean, the problem is with the UN, it is very bureaucratic. There has been quite high levels of corruption. You'd get people appointed to the UN from individual countries, more or less in proportion to their own size, and they often basically appoint people who are past it in their careers. They don't necessarily appoint the best people. And what the UN needs is much greater professionalism and, I think, more ethical behavior by many of the people. The salaries are pretty high, unacceptably so. But against that, you've also got to accept that there have been some areas where the UN has actually been very significant in peace building and peacekeeping roles. And some of the specialist agencies have a good track record. World Health Organization, for example. And if you look back historically, you take the UN Conference on Trade and Development back in the 60s, it was advocating the kinds of reforms which have made a huge development change to the development prospects of the global south. That was lost, but the ideas were there, and they may well be re-established at some time.
And what about what our previous guest, Bob Ayres, as security specialist, was saying? When you look at the United Nations, when you look at the Security Council, it puts out these resolutions, but there is no real enforcement mechanism. And one of our guests in the studio, Sylvie Bradwell, says, you know, there is no standing army. What about those kinds of reforms? You know, real teeth and a standing army.
If you have a standing army, and there are many reasons why you should consider that, then basically some states will oppose that because they don't want a kind of multinational body interfering in the individual sovereignty of states. One of the ways around this is to move in a way in which you don't go for standing army, but you go for what is called a UN emergency peace service. And that would certainly include people who are capable of active peacekeeping, maybe even combat, but also be permanently available to handle things like major emergencies, something like Ebola, or an earthquake, or the hurricanes that have hit the Caribbean. And the idea is you would have a range of countries of different cultures, different backgrounds, all contributing really high-grade people for up to 4 years at a time. A force maybe 15 or 20,000 strong. That might be the kind of way to proceed, something not just a standing army, but pointing in that direction.
All right, Paul Rogers, Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. Emeritus Professor, thank you very much indeed. So let's see how our panel would change things. Who wants to go first? Because I can see you are chomping at the bit. Some of you are nodding vigorously. I think, Sylvie, you were nodding vigorously, weren't you?
I agree with a lot of what the professor was saying. But unfortunately, it is a lot of wishful thinking, because the reality is that for the member, those who have the veto, to vote for reform, it will be like turkeys voting for Christmas, and that's the big problem we now have.
Do you think one of the things that might result from the weakening of the UN, because some people complain and it's got no influence really, that regional bodies like the African Union, like the Latin American states, like the ASEAN group of countries may become stronger and take greater ownership of what happens in their own theatre of influence?
I don't think so, in the sense that a lot of regional institutions like the African Union, like the Arab League, and so on, have already, by the time the United Nations get involved, it's because these regional bodies have already failed.
Yeah.
And what is needed, actually, is for either the regional bodies or the United Nations to adopt specific reforms that will enable them to have end results and specific goals. If we take the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, there have been soldiers of the United Nations there for more than 60 years, and still it is at war.
Yeah.
If the aim is to avoid war, disarm the militia and take a proper, strong mandate that will end the war.
All right.
As simple as that.
Richard, your closing thoughts?
My closing thought is that it probably is a reflection of the way power actually is. And if that is to change in a way, then what you have to do is to make the powers that be understand that it's in their interest to pursue a common interest. That is where the argument needs to be based. And, you know, America and Russia and China and wherever have to understand that it's in their interests to have a common, as it were, a common goal.
A common goal and a common purpose. Closing thought with you, Lola, then, the most powerful, pregnant thought of the show.
No, I think that the Constitution, in terms of how the member states act, has to be changed.
Right.
Because that's the only way to
You're talking about the General Assembly or the Security Council?
The Security Council.
Yeah.
That has to be changed, because otherwise people will not vote against their own powers, basically. So I think that is the key to real change.
When you look at the composition of the Security Council, you know, the rotating membership of 10, and then you have the 5 permanent members, what would you do? Would you say there must be a place for India, There must be a place for when you've got a whole continent in Africa. How would you deal with that problem?
There has to be. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense, but the issue later is surely this. If you say that the rules have to be changed. If, for instance, you were to take away the veto, right? Are you seriously telling me that, you took away the veto, so, for instance, Russia couldn't veto? You're more likely to get war, it seems to me, if we were going to actually mandate the UN to move into Russia's sphere, theatre of influence.
Yeah, now, I understand. Diplomatically, it's very difficult. But what I'm saying is that if it is actually really to, take on the powers that it can, it doesn't make sense that members can vote against the change that will make it better. Yeah. I mean, then there's no point trying to reform anything then.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there on that kind of conundrum. There's no point. Thank you very much indeed. A really enjoyable and vigorous discussion. And that's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Sylvia Abua-Bradwell, Richard Phillips and Lola Adesoye. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.